Cold War of the 50s. Dwight Eisenhower really was the so-called foreign policy president. He had been a general during World War II, and as such, he really understood military power and how it could serve political ends. So keep in mind, Eisenhower during World War II, he had helped, hold together the alliance against, the Nazis and everything. He had then gone on to help build NATO, especially in like 1951 through 52. And then he actually sought out the Republican nomination to basically ensure the United States would keep its international commitments. This is going to end up sealing his victory in 1952 because he really is going to emphasize his foreign policy expertise. However, Eisenhower's administration is really going to be important not just for what it did do, but actually what it didn't do. So the thing is, Eisenhower's administration isn't going to dismantle the social programs of the New Deal, which is a big deal. And then on top of that, they're going to avoid war even while exerting all this like political and military power across the globe. Eisenhower was really good at being able to delegate authority. He kept disagreements private. He was a very good tactician in that he would mask his intelligence from the American population. Americans really view him as this smiling grandfather figure, and you can kind of see that in the top right corner picture there. And he just knew exactly how to take advantage of that. For instance, he was really the first president to have televised news conferences, and he knew how to manipulate these agencies. He would give these rambling, incoherent answers at White House press conferences, but this was specifically done to control information and basically keep his opposition guessing. So it's not really a surprise when he was easily reelected in 1956. Spoilers. However, you have to keep in mind that he is presiding over America during the Cold War. This rivalry between the USSR and the United States is going to really play out within a framework of deference. Basically, there is this knowledge on both sides that the other side at any given moment could launch a devastating nuclear attack. So what you really see here is a balance, but a balance of terror. Because basically we're seeing this doctrine of massive retaliation. This is the idea that atomic weapons would be used in response to any serious attack. And what would happen is if the Soviet Union attacked the United States would then direct maximum force against the Soviet Union. We would drop atomic weapons basically on them, but then presumably they would do the same if America was to attack. And so this doctrine becomes more and more fearful as time goes on, especially when the Soviet Union starts developing their own hydrogen bombs, for instance. All these nuclear tests in the late 50s are going to mean that this atomic threat is a lot more immediate. We get things like signs for air raid shelters posted on downtown buildings, and we have citywide air raid drills. There'd be stories published about only a handful of survivors grouping through the ruins of an atomic war-filled society, so to speak. You can actually see this in popular culture today. The video game Fallout is taking place in a post-apocalyptic world due to massive retaliation and everything. The thing is, with this doctrine, basically Eisenhower's administration is going to use America's superior technology and economize military spending. America couldn't really match the standing armies of China and Russia. And there was this concern if America tried to, it might increase the federal government's role too much and basically take away from other social problems going on during this time period. So this is why they're going to concentrate their military spending on the greatest advantage being the atomic weapon. But this is really gearing America towards this issue of massive retaliation and everything. Now, what adds to this issue is going to be the initial part of the space race. The Soviet Union is going to add to these worries of atomic war by launching their first artificial satellite known as Sputnik, and that's pictured here on the right. By the way, Sputnik is literally Russian for just satellite. Americans are going to find out about Sputnik on the first Sunday in October in 1957. Basically, the Soviet Union has Sputnik now orbiting the Earth, and then from there, the Soviet Union would actually lift a dog into orbit. Meanwhile, American rockets are fizzling on the pad. Now, there are certain things Americans are going to point out as, oh, this is why America's better than the Soviet Union, and this is why democracy and capitalism are better than communism. But the fact that the Soviet Union was doing better initially in the space race is they're going to say, is proof of the superiority of communism. Now, this does concern the United States. They were worried about losing their edge, and they're going to actually end up beefing up their school science courses and introducing new math. They're also going to pass the National Defense Education Act. This is going to expand college and postgraduate education. And you're going to see the establishment of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. This is what's going to take over the satellite program in 1958. While this is a big deal, this crisis is more apparent than really real. There is a symbolic impact of Sputnik, keep in mind, and there's this fear that the Russians are spying on America and everything through Sputnik. They weren't necessarily, but as much as there's this symbolic impact, we are going to see Eisenhower kind of overlooks this. He actually rejected the use of military rockets for the United States space program, and this is concerning to some people because meanwhile you're hearing rumors that the Soviet Union is building hundreds of ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles basically that could potentially overwhelm the American air defenses and such. And so critics are going to charge Eisenhower as having a do-nothing administration that might put the United States in peril. Now, if you actually rewind to when Eisenhower was first elected, the campaign speeches of 1952, you might have expected there to be a drastic change in foreign policy once Eisenhower took office. The reality, though, is it's just going to be more continuity than actual change. In fact, Eisenhower really views the Cold War in similar terms to Truman. A lot of the campaign rhetoric had been about rolling back communism. So that means pushing communism out of countries that it has already taken over in. But the reality of the situation is that the United States is really going to accept the existing sphere of communist influence. More than that, they're really going to just try to attempt to block the growth of communism. So it's not so much rolling back communism as it's going to actually be containing communism. This comes into the idea that the United States worldview at this point will assume that the United States has the right and the need to interfere in the affairs of other nations, especially in countries like in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And you have to keep in mind, countries in these regions were seen as, first of all, markets for United States products, but also as a place they could gain resources from and a source of vital raw materials, basically. So we are going to see the United States meddle in these different areas. Now, the United States is going to blame the Soviet Union meddling to justify their own intervention. And the idea was basically, well, okay, communism can't be pushed back in East Europe. well, at least it could be in these other places around the world. And you do have to keep in mind, like, the Soviet Union is taking advantage of like local revolutions, even if they didn't necessarily instigate them. And that's just confirming Americans' belief that the developing world was basically this like game board that they could carry on this rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so we're going to see things like the CIA would subvert democratically elected governments that seem to threaten the United States' interests, even though they were democratically elected. This is going to be in places like Iran and Guatemala. But really, if you asked your average American what they were concerned about the most when it came to the Cold War, it was ending the Korean War. They wanted to stabilize their relationship with China. Eisenhower is going to be very careful about this. He is not going to escalate the Korean War. He will not blockade China or send in more United States troops. Instead, all that money has gone into atomic weaponry, so he's going to use it in a sense. Basically, he would position atomic bombs on Okinawa, which was only 400 miles away from China. So there's an underlying threat here. Plus, you have to keep in mind the continuing cost of the Korean War at this point. Remember, they had fought to a stalemate and were basically in like trench warfare. And so this is going to actually end up bringing about the truce that ends up leaving Korea divided into two nations. And we also see the United States gets involved other places like Egypt. In Europe, though, Eisenhower's going to accept the status quo, basically. There was this fear that conflicts there could indeed precipitate into nuclear war. A great example of this actually is Hungary. So in Hungary, which you can see here, was really one of the satellite nations of the Soviet Union, you actually get reformers taking steps and proposing that Hungary actually quits the Warsaw Pact. This is actually going to end up with open warfare when the Soviet Union would arm themselves and actually roll across the border to preserve the Soviet Empire. We get Hungarian freedom fighters fighting and then pleading Western nations for aid. But NATO will not step in because it would have risked direct war with the USSR. So in the end, you see tens of thousands of Hungarians die in this, and about 200,000 would flee when the Soviet Union did crush the resistance there. So the Soviet Union is making it very clear that you cannot just quit their basically control. So overall, looking at the Cold War during this time period, you're seeing a global standoff. There is one international crisis after another. Each side is misinterpreting the other's motivations and diplomatic signs, and both sides are going to give dangerously different meanings to these confrontations that occur from about 1950-ish even through 1964. The most important aspect of Eisenhower's foreign policy really is the continuity from Truman's. The United States really cannot see any developing world country like in their own terms. They're always going to view them as basically a part of this competition, a part of this rivalry with the Soviet Union, and thus view with them a lens of competition in regards to communism. And this is going to create, well, frankly, unnecessary problems.